Volume 2 Chapter 41. Henry, Nfia, and Nina approached the shattered unit. He really was telling the truth. It's still hard to believe, Nfia said as they stepped over corpses to reach the fallen king and his head warrior. King Ramposa was wiser than we knew, Henry said while leaning over to close the wide-open eyes of the fallen king. His real enemies weren't on the other side of the battle line, but around him. So this was what, penance? Nina asked, planting her staff on the ground. The rest of the army had surrendered as soon as the last of the nobles fell, and at that moment they were stripping off their armor and donning regular clothes, ready to go back home. Queen Henry shrugged. I honestly don't know. Maybe? He probably heard what his son did, maybe the shame was too much, maybe the guild's terms of apology were too great. Maybe losing his only boys was too much? Maybe this was just the only way to make sure he was successful. Nfia grunted as he tried to pick up the royal head warrior's sword. Gah. This is heavy. He must have really lived up to the legend of his lifetime. The young king said, looking over the fallen corpse who lay pinned across his king's body. I could see that. Who knows what lies he spun to the nobles, but he got them all together, and told us where they were, and if his daughter and the Marquis did their work well, then the rest are purged in the capital too. So much for asking Sir Moman to rule us though. Which is honestly a shame. You don't want to be a king, Nfi? Henry asked and reached out to take his hand. Nfia vigorously denied it. No, being your husband and an apothecary of some note, doing my research, making my potions, that's what I wanted, those I take by choice, but the crown is being forced on me. Henry squeezed his hand. I'll make it up to you. Every night, as long as you can keep up. I'll do my best, Nfia said with a dry voice giving the lie by the gleam in his eyes. Nina pointed to the kingdom soldiers. Do you really want to send them all back? That was the agreement. Henry replied, I wish the head warrior lived to see that we kept it, but for his own reasons. I guess he didn't want to survive his king. We'll send both their bodies home with proper honors. King Ramposa III might not have been a perfect king, but he gave his life to try to set things right. So he can't have been all bad. But that many soldiers? Nina asked. The Wolf Queen shrugged it off, without armor, or weapons, or the will to fight. We can be generous once to people who had no choice about coming against us. Besides, I don't want to start things off acting like. Understood, my queen. Nina replied, understood. She shuddered at the comparison she was sure was coming. In the end, the plunder of weapons, armor, and war gear, less that carried by the king and his most loyal servant, took dozens of carts to fill, and the army that had been brought to destroy the rebellion, left feeling grateful to the rebels for their lives. Their one task, bury the dead of their own side, and then depart with enough food to go back to their homes. The sound of thousands of spades heaving earth, the smell of stirred-up grass and blood, it still made Nfia feel like Henry seemed to be whenever she visited his workshop. But it had to be done. The ranks of the wolves of Carney formed up before sunset, and began the walk home to await the official concession of their independence. Are you worried they'll go back on it? Nina asked when she rode beside her queen. No, not really. Sir Moman went that way. I'm confident that he'll persuade any opposition that going to war against us would be a futile waste. The Wolf Queen replied, and we'll reach out to Master Gown as well. We can repay our debt much faster now. I doubt he'd be pleased to know the people he rescued are under threat again before we can properly pay him back. Satisfied grins ran all around. A kingdom. A real kingdom. I never imagined, Nina gasped as the reality began to set in. Britta. She would have been very proud, Henry said in a quiet whisper. That left them somber until they returned to Carney. The ramparts of the village were jam-packed with people, the roaring and cheering soared over the heads of the returning victors, but before they could enter, Henry called a halt. Before I enter my home again, I want a moment of silence for the honored dead. Henry bowed her head, and both soldiers and residents alike did the same. When she raised her head, and others with her, the gate opened, and the Wolf Queen and Wolf King rode into their home in triumph. When she stopped at what she still thought of as the village center, and turned around to see her army had not even fully entered the gate yet, another sober realization hit her. By the gods! We're going to grow. Massively, and soon. She felt the hot wind of change rushing over her body, but forced herself to focus. Husband. Would you? Henry asked, and Nfia obliged, against his wishes, then rose up in his stirrups. I'm not one for long speeches, I'm not eloquent or gifted in that. So I'll be brief. We fought, we won, we're free of the old and able to build something new. Let's do better than they did, tomorrow. But for now, go and celebrate however you see fit. Nfia's brief speech went over very well with those who were casting hungry looks on lovers who had been apart for far longer than they wanted to be, a sensibility he shared. He cantered his horse over to their home, Henry and Nina on either side. You two. You need your privacy. I think. I'm going to spend time with my sister, and work out what comes next for her. Nina started off with a happy expression, but a bitter, difficult, sorrowful one replaced it. It'll be all right. She survived a lot to make it this far. Just have faith in her, Henry said with a sympathetic look. With that said, Nfia and Henry entered the house where they found Peter and Lecruit sitting at the table as if the pair had been waiting for the royal couple to return. Henry started to frown, but Lecruit held up his hands in surrender. Wait, hear me out. I just wanted to fill you in on everything before we settle in around here. Also, Lecruit briefly stopped, I wanted to say thank you. I know, my queen, that you were thinking of Britta with that moment of silence. I was too. We were never an item, you know. Never a couple, not really, but if only she'd lived? The irrepressible blonde flirt's hands shook so badly he shoved them into his lap to hide them. I think, maybe. But now I'll never know. I could flirt with 100 women a day, get turned down every time and I'm fine by the next beer, but that one. I just couldn't say what I wanted to, now I can't. Maybe she knew? Henry offered, and Lecruit closed his eyes and shook his head. No, my queen, she was too much like you, too dense to notice when a man is over the moon for you until he makes it impossible to ignore. He flashed a winning smile up at Henry, who dropped her mouth open in disbelief at his bold statement, until Nfia started to laugh, and all Henry could do was laugh with him. Lecruit and Peter accomplished the same response, and it was hard enough that Lecruit had to wipe away a tear. I let her go and die without saying anything, I won't make that mistake next time. Anyway, about what Peter and I managed. Henry listened as best she could, but the truth was she kept turning an eye toward the bedroom, so often that it was a relief to be done, and she fairly dragged Nfia in after her, tearing at his clothing as rapidly as he tore at hers. It wasn't until after she was lazy, happy and exhausted in bed, that Henry had the distinct sensation that she was being watched. Rena looked up at the sun. It was a little warm overhead, but not yet unbearable. The sound of a rope snapping taut and the creaking noise of the swaying body was drowned out by ears. The next noble was brought up, on the charge of selling peasants to be turned into dust whores. How do you plead? Predictably, he shouted, not guilty. His fine clothes and fat body did nothing to endear him to the crowd. But when the judge presented the receipt of sale, the crowd roared out their boos. The sentence is death, Princess Rena announced. And another fat noble almost snapped the rope before the rope could snap his neck. So it went, until there were no surviving old nobility that were not too young to matter. Before word even reached the city that the battle was lost, that the king was dead, and the conflict was at its end, there was already an excitement in the air at the feel of change. The evening of the last hanging, Princess Rena called together the current head of the Adventurers Guild, the Merchants Guild, the Mages Guild, and various other key artisan and crafts guilds. She also called together the largest farmers and miners, everybody of importance but no title within the city. They sat around the long table, clad in the clothing of their professions, while Princess Rena sat at the head of the table with Clyme at her right hand, and the Marquis Reven at her left, one of the last survivors of the old nobility. Armed guards filled the role of servants, the clink of armor and smell of oil wafted through the air, but was quickly drowned out by the smell of good wine, something these preeminent men of their trades uniformly appreciated. However, they had the good sense to not touch their cups, until the Princess of Purge touched her own. When she did, she didn't drink, instead, she spoke. I'm not telling any of you anything new when I talk about the divisiveness, petty politics, and absurdity of the old nobility. You yourselves were often its victims, so we can skip that part. The princess said, keeping her tone quite blunt and drawing their attention all the more for doing so. The kingdom needs people to rule it, but we don't need incompetent rulers who have no idea how to do anything but abuse their power. So, I am going to establish a new nobility. You, Rena said, pointing to both sides of the tables with her arms outstretched. Stunned into silence that did not even let them babble, she was free to continue. However, I didn't just get rid of one problem to get a whole new set of them. I'm the last unbound heir of King Ramposa III. So you have two choices. Hail me as the first queen of Riestais, or risk civil war. Do I need to tell you how well most of you will fare during civil war? Pale faces and looks of horror was proof enough that she did not. We were lucky enough that the wolves of Kani only wanted independence, and that my father found a way to salvage the kingdom at the end. You won't be that lucky twice. Besides that, the entire plan hinges on a clean succession that lets us make a smooth peace with the new kingdom to the east. Rena paused for effect. Without that, war resumes and you'll have angry peasants, goblins, trolls, nagas, and who knows what else rampaging all over the kingdom. What do you think they'll do to your livelihoods? To the pale faces, were added horrified, hyperventilating breaths from more than a few men who most greatly depended upon peace for their prosperity. Exactly. So, tomorrow, I will have it announced that I am the new queen of Riestais, and you gentlemen, will spend the rest of that day getting ennobled. And in return, as your first gift you will make sure that the entire city is overjoyed at my ascension. Are we clear? Rena batted her eyes at them as if she were innocently giving them the time of day, when in fact she was dangling the world before their eyes. Heads bobbed like wobbling dolls. There are some additional conditions. For starters, your title will only remain the same or increase, if your child marries someone of merit rather than blood nobility, or completes 7 years of service to the crown when they come of age. I won't have talent languishing at the bottom. You gentlemen know the value of talented learners, embrace that in your nobility as well. Rena waited while they let that sink in, and then she added her final condition. A large part of the destruction and hatred, not to mention general distrust, came from seeing nobles with no connection to the common people. Therefore I intend my reign to begin in the exact opposite way. I will marry a commoner that I elevate to the ranks of the nobility. A man well known for his skill, power, bravery, and protectiveness of the people. Rena reached beside her to touch the hand of her bodyguard. I will wed Climb, and he will be my consort. Through his ascension, and yours, all the kingdom will have hope for better lives, even if we suffered some losses before today. Are there any objections? Princess Rena asked in a sweet voice that said there damn well better not be any. Princess, you didn't. I don't. Climb stared down at her, more than a little flustered. Marquis Reven, however, shook his head and looked down at the young blonde warrior. Now, noble Climb, your wife-to-be asked if there were any objections, and speaking as a married man, I advise you to understand now that it's always happier when, with some women, there are none. The Marquis was rewarded by a radiant smile from the princess that almost made him forget just what she truly was, though perhaps he'll temper her some, we can only hope. He thought, and Climb fell to quiet blushing. Now, there's only one final matter to attend to, and then I'll let you all go to spread the word among your people about what I expect tomorrow. And remind key members that there are more titles and lands to be had, than there are spaces at this table. Rena's voice stilled the budding conversation. As you know, my father, brothers, and Gazif Stranov were all killed in the conflict. Our nation needs a new royal head warrior. And I could think of no one better than the man who broke the back of 8 fingers. Sir Moman, would you join us, please? Rena called out, and right on cue, Pandora's actor opened the door and stood behind the throne. You accept the job, don't you, Sir Moman? Rena asked rhetorically. The towering onyx warrior looked down the length of the table and crossed his arms, defying anyone at the table to consider opposing her selection. My queen, I would be pleased to accept such an offer. My partner, after all, has decided she missed her friends from Kani and has chosen to return. That leaves me free for as long as you need me to. Help keep order. Pandora's actor said in a voice that was deep, noble, and menacing all at once. If there were any thoughts of rebellion, they were quashed at the sight of the unbeatable champion with ties to the new Kani kingdom and the new Wolf Queen, with the power to crush and slay skeletal dragons all by himself, taking a side with the new Riestais administration. That worked out well, Rena thought. Father's plan wasn't bad, but Lord Demiurge's was better, but that's to be expected. I still need to satisfy my curiosity about whether Moman is Master Gaun's son, or brother, or what. But for now it's enough to know. There's nobody left in my way. Volume 2 Chapter 42. The coronation of Queen Rena and King Clyme resulted in a celebration that spanned 3 straight days, the streets so overwhelmed with music, performances and not to mention drunkards. It was harder for Gagrin to navigate the streets than it was to navigate a battlefield. At least on the battlefield I can swing my hammer at things. She groused a bit, but all in all, her spirits were high, and at least the alcohol was cheap, a collaborative project of multiple guilds to temporarily lower the price on everything. A popular opening move. I always thought Rena was naive, but maybe I misjudged her. Or maybe that was the people she appointed, making their own opening moves to win favor? Gagrin felt her head start to hurt at even the prospect of trying to work all that out, and quickly put it out of her mind. Instead she focused on the matter at hand, getting to her favorite booth. Weaving around or slightly shoving her way through the crowd of revelers on the corner, including a few adventurers as she drew ever closer to her goal, might have been time-consuming, but it was worth it. It was worth it because of what she saw when she went in. Lake Hughes stood and waved her over. The twins remained seated and raised their cups, but Evil Eye, there. Her shorty jumped up on the booth and waved her hands like a wild monkey for Gagrin to join them. Though she couldn't see the bright eyes of her sister behind the mask she never removed, it didn't stop her from imagining a young girl with bright blue eyes overjoyed at everything good in her life. Gagrin felt herself almost skip to the booth before she claimed her seat. Can you believe it, Gagrin? Sir Moman is here. And he'll be here for a long, long time. I'll get to see him often, without having to wait for jobs. She clapped her hands together and let out a joyful little wee noise. Yeah, great, but I kinda miss Little Red, Gagrin chuckled. Little who? The twins asked at once. Oh, his little red-haired cleric. She was fun to drink with, but she's gone all the way to Carney, a whole other kingdom now, or it will be next week, or tomorrow, or however long it takes for the rider to get the signed treaty from Riastais to there. Gagrin put the math out of her head and instead brought a mug of beer dropped off for her, straight to her lips. Does she know about that nickname? Lake Hughes asked with a funny cock-eyed look. I'll tell her about it over drinks, which we know you'll be buying. Gagrin winked at Evil Eye, who groaned good-naturedly at the reminder. So what's next for us though, other than watching Shorty try to seduce Sir Moman? Gagrin asked, prompting Evil Eye to fume and pout in the corner of the booth. A lot, actually. The Draconic Queen is begging for help from everyone she can ask, and there isn't much else in the way of contracts right now, so I was thinking we head there, at least for a season. Lake Hughes suggested. Can she afford us? Evil Eye asked. We'll find out soon. But for now, we drink. Lake Hughes ordered her team, and 5 sets of frothing mugs sold on the cheap were raised and crushed with a splash together at the center of the booth. To the future of the kingdom, they shouted, and a diminutive little masked caster added under her breath. And my future with Sir Moman. If anyone heard her, and they certainly did, they were kind enough not to say so. Arch wobbled and fell over into the sand. She remained on all fours there, while Sabos poured water and handed it to her. You've done enough for now. No, I haven't. I have to repay him, and you for what was done for me. For my unworthy self. Arch did not raise her head, and Sabos sensed that reluctance was not due to physical weakness. Arch, you and your companions have been working so hard that even the Supreme Being himself, the one who stayed, has praised your efforts. Sabos replied with the steady, stable voice he commonly used. Sir Sabos, that isn't it. I know how many died in the tomb, how many workers suffered terrible ends, but the truth is, I'm no different than they were. If Foresight had been offered the chance to raid here, the chance to rob this place and, well, would I have done it? I think so. Arch bit her lower lip. The only thing that separates me from a deserved death and who I am now, alive and growing stronger, is a bit of luck in encountering you and your kindness. You'd have been within your rights to throw me aside a dozen times that night in my home. Don't even try to deny it, Arch said with a bitter smile staring down at the sand. I won't deny it. But that isn't what happened, and even if that had been the case, Arch, you would have been acting out of love for your sisters, enough that you would have given up your life for them. Yes, you and your team would have been villains, and killed for it. But you'd have been villains for the right reason. Now you have a new chance, don't dwell on the wrong you never did. Only focus on the right you can do. Arch wiped her face on her green sleeve. You're amazing, Sir Sabos. Ah, Would it be alright if I asked you to at least let me make you dinner at my little cabin? Quadrica and Eureka haven't seen you in days, and they miss you. I would be honored, thank you. Sabos gave a half bow and held a white-gloved hand out to help Arch up. Now, take a break, we need to see if your level has gone up, and the rest of your team. Lord Ines has a use for you on the Katsa Plains. As you wish, and Arch felt blood rise to her cheeks as she looked up into the rugged face of the one to save her sisters and herself. May I just call you Sabos, please? Her blush went much deeper for an instant and she squeaked out, if not, that's okay. I don't want to be too forward or. Sabos let out a low, dignified, gentlemanly laugh. If it pleases you, it pleases me. Arch, now let's go, we have to see about increasing your potential. As you wish, Sabos. As you wish. Arch responded, and followed where he led her. The three former elven slaves bowed deeply as the master of Nazarick passed. Once I end the Empire's army at the Katsa Plains, I'll have proven my claim to kingship, and I'll have to come up with a proper title. Just king is so banal. Plus all the coolest rulers had great titles. Wait. Am I being Chunibyo again? He asked, and shuddered with worry that he might be. Instead of lingering on that unpleasant thought, he turned his mind towards something better. Almost everybody now knew of his changing. All that remained was solution, Narbril, Demiurge, Albedo, and Shultier. Before or after the battle. When is it better? Lupus Regina had a good point about the greater good. If I win just one decisive battle, I might save lives in the long run. Trying to avoid making enemies of anyone, trying not to hurt anyone, trying not to offend anyone, I'll just end up with no one on my side at all. It was this sort of thinking that made Ines turn over the events of the Riastais Civil War. Henry made hard choices, so did Nfia, and Nina, so did King Ramposa and Rena. I need a model of kingship to study, and he's dead now. I'll have to think about whom to watch. His thoughts rambled on, independent of his desire to focus, and his desire to navigate, which was no doubt why he found his way to his room and was through the door before he really noticed where he'd gone. The smell of perfume coming from off his sheets, it was enticing beyond all measure, and all he wanted was to slide between them and sleep. I may sleep fine away from Nazarick. But, maybe because this is my true home, I always have the best dreams in my own bed. He thought, but instead forced himself to sit down at the desk and review at least some of the reports that had been delivered. If the name Kingdom of Nazarick doesn't get the attention of any players, it's because there are none here. He muttered under his breath, and his heart skipped a beat. You're alone here. The thought was one that filled him with dread, and he pushed it down. No, it seems like the founders of the theocracy were players, and some of the other ones to appear, they may have been NPCs. Even if there are no players now, we seem to be appearing at different points in time. My friends might come later. Or the thought began hopeful, but as he thought about it, a new kind of dread came over him. Hostile players were bad enough, at least they'd still have human memories, and would likely be cooperative in a new environment. But there were NPCs as dangerous or more so than his own. In-game bosses who lived only to spread destruction. The thought gave new urgency to his constant training to increase his other skills. I was worried about my own NPC's reactions, but the true danger might be worse than that. Ines began to breathe hard as he recalled some of the worst dangers of the game, and then imagined them real, alive, and driven by their backstories. The greater good. He thought to himself, recalling Lupus Regina's words not that long ago. In a few days the Kingdom of Nazarick would take the field for the first time against, if the papers he was sent were right, 30,000 Baharuthian Imperial Knights. If the rest of the world is no stronger than what I've seen so far, that will be easy. But I also know I can break the level caps of others now, though how far that goes remains to be seen. Could Arch surpass Blue Rose? Could Blue Rose reach level 100? Just how powerful are the individual knights? When the knights arrived, his first plan was a battle of champions pitting Foresight against a few of the Empire. A formal duel likely wouldn't be rejected. After that, what spell will I use? The thought of ending so many lives made him physically ill, his stomach rebelling against the idea. He covered his mouth and swallowed the reflux back down. The greater good. If destructive NPCs come this way again, or destructive players, maybe, I might be the only one who can stop them. Or at least the only one who can give those in this world the power to stop them. Ainz noticed the paper in his hands was shaking. He set it down, then rested his hands on the smooth onyx surface and breathed in slowly and deeply for several minutes until his hands stopped the incessant trembling. He took up the next one. It was still sealed. He cracked the red wax and opened the tan paper to find a royal greeting. From the house of Auriculus, greetings, he read. Auriculus. Oh yes. Queen Draudillan. He let out a little smile of pride at the accomplishment. Memorizing names of various rulers paid off. He read on. It is with a glad heart that we welcome you to the family of kingdoms. As Ainz read on, he felt a profound sense of dignity from the author. The Queen's prose was flawless and suggested an abundant education in royal mannerisms. She's been ruling for a very long time. And there's an invitation to visit her kingdom. The idea was profoundly tempting, even if they were in the middle of an invasion. When I'm done with the Empire's army, my territory will somewhat border hers. The beastmen don't seem like the best neighbors. Perhaps I can peacefully acquire some territory in exchange for some form of aid. It wasn't a bad idea, but then there was the other matter. I need more resources, and the dwarf kingdom is right there. It made him reach to the right side of his desk, one of the little things picked up in the Empire as a curiosity. A dagger with a rune on it. Runecraft. Enchanting without resources. For the salaryman he was in his old world, it was the equivalent of free meals. Perhaps I can send Albedo, Demiurge, or Shiltir there and put off the truth a little longer. He clenched his eyes tightly shut against the rising sense of frustration. Keeping the secret of his transformation felt like betrayal. Avoiding them might have even stung them a bit, but Ainz knew it couldn't be put off forever. At level 150 now, he wasn't worried about losing. But the notion of hurting Peroncino's daughter, or Tabulus Maragdina's, or the son of Albert, having to raise his sword or cast his spells against them, it was far too much. You are a coward, Satoru, Ainz told himself, but that didn't change his mind. He set the royal greeting from Queen Draudillan aside and took up the next paper in the stack, mostly to avoid thinking about which of three were most dangerous to tell next. This seal, he recognized. Slain Theocracy. He thought, and broke the seal, then began to read. The nations of humanity are beset on all sides. We object, not to the founding of this nation, but that the kingdom of Nazarick and that the empire of Baharuth should begin by destroying the precious gift of human lives. If a path to peace may be found, we pray to the six that you both will seek it, for the common good of man. He set the letter down and immediately tossed it aside. Hypocrites. They were slaughtering peasants as easily as fishermen hooked fish. Who are they to object to anything? He asked rhetorically, not that he thought they were entirely wrong. This world is dangerous for the weak, no question about that. But still he saw no reason to respond. I should pay them a visit however. I'm curious about their abilities beyond those pathetic scriptures. He made a mental note, and his thoughts turned to Nigun. The surviving Sunlight Scripture members were probably being baptized now. They'll be as useful as Hilma, or better. Eventually. About that, he felt no guilt to speak of, and it fell away from his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair and began to rock it as he considered his options. Decisions, decisions, decisions. Ainz recited and crossed his arms over his chest. I can't put it off forever. But maybe just a few days more. I'll take care of Baharuth first. And then we'll see. He told himself, and even though he knew it was procrastinating just a little bit, it felt pretty good to feel like had some room to breathe. That would be good enough for now. The former Madame Fert sat at her little fruit stand. She took several copper coins and handed over a banana to a customer. Seemingly with an expression of greed, she put the coins into a heavy iron box beneath her wheeled stand. But the truth was the coins were an afterthought. Instead, her eyes were turned up toward the auction block. Another pair of dark elf slaves. She cursed. And again tried to fight back tears, listening to the bidding go on, seeing the fear on their little faces. Is that what my Kwukau and Ryari went though? My girls. I'm sorry. I failed you. But I'll find you. I'll go to every auction, ask everyone I meet. And one day, someday, I'll find where you are and beg your forgiveness. I promise. I will never ever give up. I will find you, buy you, and set you free. After that, whatever you say or do, I will accept. I deserve nothing less. She thought, and watched as a young man ascended the block, while she idly handed another customer their order. and dropped a copper coin into the box without breaking her rhythm. Volume 3, Kingdom of the Lizardmen. Are you ready? Ainz asked the assembled band of Foresight. They stood on the sands of the arena with their arms crossed behind their backs and feet shoulder-width apart. The equipment they now wore was far removed from the trash items they came with. More than that though, so were their bodies. Hecarim's blonde hair had grown down shoulder length, and the pale blue of his eyes became hard as ice. He still had his cheery moments, but now he was all business. His twin swords were replaced by vastly improved equipment stronger than adamantite, a blade of white and a blade of black. The white robbed its victims of their stats temporarily, transferring some of them to the bearer of the weapon. The black inflicted horrendous wounds. He wore dragon skin armor and boots, with fine bones woven into the double-layered material, giving it a slight ridge appearance if you looked closely, almost like an outer skeleton. The skin was a faint grayish blue, almost metallic, but not quite. Imina, and the rest, wore armor that matched his own, but unlike his, which was enchanted against piercing damage, her own set was enchanted to enhance her speed and dexterity. Her long purple hair hung long as it had, but when Ainz asked that question and they answered as one, "Yes, my lord," Imina did something more. At her side she wore a dagger, a backup for her enchanted golden bow that was strung with string taken from Fenrir's hair. It was the dagger she reached for in silence. She held it up to the binding point where her long strands hung in all their crowning glory. "Master," she said with the utmost reverence, "you returned our arch to us. Spared our lives when you could have killed us. Given us more than we deserve when, in another life, we might have been among those who sought to rob you. No, we would have been, I'm sure of it." And in one smooth motion, she severed the long strands she took so much pride in and let them fall to her feet. She raised one foot and stomped down, hard, grinding them into the sand when she twisted her foot back and forth. "I pledge myself again, if I fail, I die trying." Roberdike's head was already shaved bald, only the faint stubble of blonde remained where his formerly neat haircut was done. In place of the old white robe he wore over his armor, he now had a robe of the same fashion, but bearing the crest of Nazarick. "Treasured God of mercy and justice, I swear I will not fail you. Your kingdom will be the most glorious in all the world, and I will grind myself into the dust to make it so." Archer's head was bowed, her blonde hair was grown out a bit, her cheap staff replaced with something far and away more powerful than before, her outfit no longer a hodgepodge of cheaply acquired gear, and her magic far superior to what it had been. "God of magic, savior of my family, what can I say but, I am your tool. Use me as you see fit." "They are loyal," Cocytus remarked from a few feet away, and Ainz turned his bare face over toward Cocytus. "Are they strong enough to win?" Ainz asked the salient question, and Cocytus nodded. "Yes, my lord," Cocytus replied in his short, abrupt fashion. "Good. We begin with the Battle of Champions. If the other side accepts, I need it well known that I offered a chance for peaceful transition, or the kingdom of Nazarick will be known as warmongers. If my champions lose..." Ainz frowned. "We won't," Foresight shouted out as one. "Good," Ainz answered, "they'd better not. My whole image lies in this gamble. If they refuse to accept the results of the duel after we win, then I can justify exterminating their army. If my champions lose, then I must concede. Of course they could refuse my duel request, but then my butchery will look worse. I could use the Guardians for this, but better to hold them in reserve, just in case. Nazarick's native forces must be held back for now." Ainz reminded himself of his decision. His heart had palpitations that he very much hated at the present. The prospect of defeat was almost unthinkable. "All right," Ainz announced, trying to sound confident. "Has the fort to hide my forces been built?" "Yes, my lord." "By Mare," Cocytus answered again. "Then it's time to go," Ainz said, praying no hint of nervousness showed in his voice before he opened the gate and vanished through the swirling hole in reality. Foresight followed him only seconds later. The sun was bright and shining down on the long wooden fort, the wind blew lightly over the hill that overlooked the lower plains ahead, and from the entrance to the fort he could see the other side. Broken towers and fortifications that sat in a half-finished or actively destroyed state stood like monuments to madness and decay. Some burned, others rotted. The space between where the two armies were, remained desolate, devoid of life. Clad in his dark magic robes, Ainz raised a hand and released a spell. Greater Obfuscation. The 9th tier spell would easily hide an attempt at looking inside the long oval fort that Mare had built for him, though it would do nothing about physical spies. Greater Light Trigger. It wasn't exactly an alarm spell, but it served his purposes. Should anyone come close to the fort at night, light would shine around them, which intended to light the way of someone. Rather, it would in this instance give them away. He then cast a message spell. Albedo, send my forces into the fort, we are ready, he said. At once, my sweet and wonderful beloved, wonder and master of my heart, Lord and Master of Nazarick. Albedo answered, and Ainz sensed her intent to continue. Albedo. The gate. He gently reminded her, and it opened a moment later. He cut the connection, and the growling hate-filled undead monsters began to fill the fort. None of his New World champions were disturbed by the presence of the undead. It had become a non-issue for them, as they had every dream of their lives fulfilled. Roberdike in particular had begun to take to them. Holiest of gods, who lets me heal the sick and care for the injured without care for cost or profit, sacred divine ruler of life and death, granter of mercy and master of my soul. I can't wait to prove the depths of my loyalty, he said while stroking the shadowy body of a Soul Eater. If the mercy given to Arch had not been sufficient for him, it had been that his master allowed him to spend his free hours going about the land using his Templar and cleric skills to heal the injured and ill without charge. He had not even asked that his name be spread. So Roberdike spread it. I work the will of God, he'd said in the kingdom of Carney, and found that his message had been well received, as a place that had also benefited from his master's mercy. That he had to protect them from humanity says enough. He is the new divine. And I will prove it. Imana was indifferent to the undead monsters. Rather than fond of them, she instead went to the entrance of the fort and slipped out, shutting the gate behind her and watching the distance. Are they here yet? Arch asked, slipping out as well and falling in beside the girl she considered a big sister. Her hands clutched her staff, holding the gift tight against her body. No, not yet. We're early. The power of our Lord to move so quickly from place to place is uniquely his. She smiled a bit down at her little sister, and her half-elven ears flicked about playfully. Personally, I'm looking forward to the slain theocracies coming. I want to see their faces full of hate for my half-breed self before I stomp a human champion into pieces. Arch shifted uncomfortably on her feet. Iman immediately flung an arm around her companion's shoulder and pulled her close. It's not that, Iman insisted immediately, not at all. It's just that those humans hate half-breeds like me, and it'll feel good to tweak their noses a bit. Right. I guess it will. Arch gave a fragile smile up to the half-elf. Just don't let that get the better of you, okay? I like you better when you're happy-go-lucky, you know? Not to worry, little sister. Imana smirked. Will they really show up? They don't fight in these kinds of things, do they? Arch asked. Yes, they'll be here. But no, not to fight. They show up as observers, probably just looking for strong humans. Imana shrugged the matter off. We're still pretty early even for, well, us. I guess Master wanted us to have some free time and stretch out a little. So the hours passed with them doing exactly that, until the sun was even higher in the sky, and the sound of marching feet came on in the distance. A handful of theocracy observers in white robes came into view first, but the distant noise of 20,000 soldiers of the Empire of Baharuth marching on the road eventually gave way to the sight of them in full battle panoply. They arrayed themselves in a simple square formation, knights in shining steel armor covered from head to toe, and in the center, 4 banners representing the 4 mightiest knights. My lord, as you predicted. Hecaran Termite said softly, your new kingdom announcement prompted them to go all out. They've sent the 4 knights. Emperor Elnix wouldn't have done that if he didn't intend to use them. Then the battle of champions is half over, Ainz said, sweating in relief beneath his mask and robes. My lord? Hecaran asked quizzically and looked up to his master's masked face. They've done what we wanted, moving according to my will. Ainz answered and left it at that. I see, Hecaran said with awe at the skill of his lord. The theocracy representative is moving to the center. Come, let's go meet with them, Ainz said, and taking out a scroll, he uttered, summon basic party mounts. The scroll burned up in blue fire, and 5 ordinary brown percherants appeared in a puff of smoke. When Ainz mounted the horse, the rest of Foresight did the same, and they began to trot down to the center space of the Katza Plains. The 4 banners of the Imperial Knights began to descend as well, kicking up dust along the way. Within a mere minute or 3, all 3 nations were represented. Predictably, the theocracy representative, acting as the neutral party, spoke first. We of the slain theocracy again protest this misuse of vital resources of humanity. We implore you all. Seek peace. This usurper demands imperial land for himself. So, that'll be a no from us, Buzzyword said with a deep, barrel-chested laugh, his long mouth open so wide it was obvious he hadn't even tried to stop himself from laughing. I, for one, Ian said, extending an upturned open hand out to them, wouldn't mind settling this in the oldest of traditions. A simple duel, your 4 champions, against my 4 champions. When we win, I will take the land I have so politely pressed for as compensation for all the harm done to my ally, the Riastai's kingdom, and the harm done to me when your empire's noble attacked my home. But nothing else. And when we win, Nazami growled, looking the robed caster over, along with the curiously silent and stern-faced champions at his back. Curiously blank faces, it's like they don't care. The closest thing to a reaction has been the way they gripped the reins of their horses when Buzzyword laughed. Then I withdraw my claim of compensation, Ines remarked, and remain on the land conceded to me by the Riastai's kingdom. You mean, in the way, don't you? Nimble asked. If you want to put it that way, I won't stop you, Ines said with a passive shrug. The 4 knights looked at one another. The prospect of a bloodless fight and an easy win by 4 famous champions over 4 unknown nobodies was an appealing one. The theocracy representatives breathed a sigh of relief. You bear witness to this bargain, Ines said, pointing to them. If they should break it, the consequences lie on their heads. It is witnessed, the leader of the delegation said with quiet reverence. Good, and your name, if I may? Ines asked. I am Cardinal Raymond Zug Loranzen. The brown-bearded cardinal bowed his head. At your service. Good, I will remember that. Ines answered. Then facing the 4 knights, he said, inform your soldiers of your decision, then return here to where my champions will wait to break you. The supreme confidence with which he spoke set all 4 of the knights' teeth on edge, and with a snarl from Nazami, they wheeled their horses about and rode back to their own lines. The theocracy delegation began to withdraw back to their place of observation, while Ines only turned his horse around and said to them, do not lose. Never, they said as one, and when he rode back to the fort, they dismounted, and stepped out of the way of their mounts. In the imperial tent, the knights were quick about commanding their mages to bless them, downing potions to enhance themselves as much as possible, and Nazami addressed the lead officer who sat in the white imperial command tent, informing him of the bargain. Lounge Vermilion listened with dismay. It's that easy? You just beat up 4 nobodies and this is all over? Yep, that easy. Buzzyword was in good humor as he downed one more potion. I'm a bit more suspicious. I don't like this, Lena said and dabbed a cloth to the pus seeping from half of her face. I don't like this either. Nimble replied, not one bit. My father once told me that if anybody ever offered to bet you a silver that they could make a mug of beer dance and spit piss in your eye, don't take it, or you'll be covered in piss and light 1 silver. Crude. Loun remarked, wrinkling his nose. Maybe, but that's what this feels like to me. Lena's replied. So just don't lose. Loun felt the rising sense of panic at even the prospect. His heart started to race and sweat sprang to his body. No plans to. Buzzyword grunted. I didn't plan for this either. Lena's answered and wiped more pus from her face, but here we are, she sighed. Come on, let's get this over with, she said and headed for the tent flap, followed by the rest of the 4 knights, ready to face their enemies.